So, continuing on from the previous video about language in the convergence of the Twain, and we're on stanza 8. And as the smart ship grew, in stature, grace, and hue, in shadowy silent distance grew the iceberg too. So, looking back at stanza 6, which begins, while was fashioning. While is at the same time. And this stanza, verse here, is a synonym for stanza. The 8th stanza starts with as the smart ship grew, repeating that same time, while the ship was being made in both stanzas 6 and 8. At the same time as this smart ship grew in stature, grace, and hue, size, grace, and color, so too did the iceberg. And notice that both the ship and the iceberg share the verb grew. Both of them are growing in size and stature at the same time. They also share the alliteration of S, or the sibilants. Smart ship belongs to the Titanic. Stature belongs to the Titanic. Shadowy, silent, distance, iceberg belong to the iceberg. So Thomas Hardy is linking these two things, the Titanic and the iceberg, through the alliteration of the S sound. And chillingly, grew rhymes with to. And that is also linking the Titanic and the iceberg. The reason it's chilling is because the iceberg was eventually going to be the downfall of the Titanic. So the fact that they were both growing at the same time is foreshadowing the disaster that's going to happen, which hasn't happened yet in the poem. Language in stanza 9. Alien they seemed to be. No mortal eye could see the intimate welding of their later history. In verse 9, although the ship and the iceberg seemed to be alien, that is, foreign, unknown to each other, the limited view of mortals, remember mortals are human beings, failed to see that their later history would be an intimate welding. People failed to see that the Titanic and the iceberg would eventually come together as one. Hardy uses in this stanza words which have romantic connotations, links, such as mate. Sometimes mate is used in a romantic way, like girlfriend, boyfriend, and intimate, personal and private. Why does he do this? Because the Titanic and the iceberg are eventually going to come together as one. And they're going to do this when the Titanic crashes into the iceberg. Hardy also juxtaposes intimate to the technological word welding. So to weld, as a reminder, means to join two pieces of metal together. And intimate is of people, personal and private. So to juxtapose means to place two words side by side for the purpose of contrast. And here, personal and private of the people is placed next to a very technological word, welding. And he might have done this to show how different the Titanic and the iceberg were. But, of course, they are going to come together as one, because that is what fate has decided. And language in stanza 10, which runs on from stanza 9, because at the end of stanza 9 there is only a comma. So it runs on in stanza 9, runs on into stanza 10. Alien they seemed to be, no mortal eye could see the intimate welding of their later history, or sign that they were bent by paths coincident, on being anon twin halves of one august event. So, human understanding, people failed to understand or to see any sign that the ship and the iceberg were bent by paths coincident. In other words, they were shaped by an outside force to coincide. Fate, the imminent will, the spinner of the years, fate, had already decided that they were going to coincide, that they were going to come together. And of course, we cannot see that because humans cannot see into the future. But fate had already decided it. Fate had already decided that they were twin halves, like male and female. The iceberg presumably is male because the Titanic is female. Ships are always female. So it's almost like they are coming together in a romantic relationship. They were twin halves of one august event, one grand, important, significant event. So it's almost like the ship, the Titanic, and the iceberg are in a relationship, but of course it's not a healthy relationship because one brings the downfall of the other. Okay, focusing now on the verbs that we see in this poem. Thomas Hardy moves the verbs around, the verbs being the words that drive the action. In the first 4 verses, you can see the stanzas open. Each first line is a verbless description of the glory of the ship. This means that there are no verbs in the first line of stanzas 1, 2, 3, and 4. And each of these describes how wonderful and glorious the Titanic is. In a solitude of the sea, steel chambers late the pyres, over the mirrors meant, jewels in joy designed. So this glorious ship, the Titanic, is now a wreck on the bottom of the sea with no movement. It is still. What movement we do see belongs to the sea. The first lines of stanzas 1, 2, 3, and 4, these verbless descriptions, lead to the verb. And the verb is the action on the seabed. And the verb appears in the final line of each verse, 1, 2, 3, and 4. In stanza 1, stilly couches she. Couches is the verb. And it is describing what is happening on the seabed. She is lying still. Cold currents thrid. The sea moves through the Titanic and turns the steel chambers into rhythmic tidal lyres or rhythmic harps. The sea worm crawls over the mirrors and the jewels lie lightless. In verse 5 or stanza 5, it is the dim moon-faced fishes that ask the big question. And query is the verb, does is the verb. So the fish is the one that is doing the verb. In the second part of, so the end of stanza 5 marks the end of the first section. And the stanza 6 starts the second part of the poem, where the imminent will starts to stir and urge everything. And we can see that the verbs move position in this part of the poem, because the imminent will, or fate, is taken over. So each time the building of the ship has a verb, so does the iceberg, and the iceberg is being prepared by the imminent will, or it's being made by fate. So fashioning belongs to the ship, prepared belongs to imminent will, and grew belongs to the ship, grew also belongs to the imminent will. Finally, by stanza 10, the Titanic and the imminent will share the same verb. They come together, and this verb is bent. On paths coincident. And bent means shaped by an outside force. So they are both shaped by an outside force, and that is fate. The final verse, stanza 11, is full of action. It's full of verbs bringing catastrophe. Finally, the Titanic has hit the iceberg. The spinner of the years said, "Now!" And it hits. Each one hears, verb, and consummation comes, verb, and jars, two hemispheres. The Titanic has hit the iceberg. So, to remind you, this is what essay question I wanted you to think about as we were looking at language. Explore the ways in which Hardy memorably responds to the sinking of the Titanic in the Convergence of the Twain. Here is 2 sections. This is how to answer it well, how to answer this question well. Here is how not to answer it. So you should engage with the language of the poem, as we just have. Focusing on the Titanic and the iceberg. You should explore the contrast between the opulence of the ship and the vanity of the people, and contrast that with the image of the ship lying at the bottom of the sea. And you should also integrate well-selected detail. What you should not do is work through the poem stanza by stanza, nor should you narrate the events. I do not need to hear the poem being retold in your own words. You don't retell the story. You pick out language and images and analyze them for how Hardy memorably responds to the sinking. You don't retell the story, nor do you make general unsupported statements or personal comments about how you feel about the sinking of the Titanic. This is focused on how Thomas Hardy responds to the sinking of the Titanic. Okay? I hope that now you have a good understanding of the language used in the Convergence of the Twain. In Monday's class, we will look at imagery and the structure of this poem.